The gunshot echoed across the vast Montana sky like thunder, startling a flock of birds from the cottonwoods along the riverbank. Abigail Warner clutched her swollen belly and ducked behind a boulder, her heart pounding against her ribs as she peered over the stone's edge at the distant figures on horseback. She had been running for too long, and now, 6 months pregnant and miles from any town, she feared her luck had finally run out. The year was 1878, and the Western Territories were still wild and untamed. Abigail had fled St. Louis 3 months prior, leaving behind a life of comfort and danger. The father of her child, a wealthy businessman with political aspirations, had made it clear that an unmarried pregnant woman would ruin his chances of becoming governor. When his suggestions had turned from marriage to more permanent solutions, Abigail had taken what money she could and boarded a westbound train. Now, as she pressed herself against a cool stone, she watched the riders turn north, away from the river. Their silhouettes grew smaller against the setting sun, and Abigail released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her momentary relief was interrupted by a sharp pain that made her double over. She needed water and rest, but most of all, she needed help. The river beckoned, its gentle gurgling a promise of life in this harsh landscape. Abigail made her way down to the edge, her boots slipping on loose stones. As she knelt by the water, cupping the cool liquid to her parched lips, she failed to notice the figure watching her from the trees. Zachary Blackwood had been tracking a wounded deer when he spotted the woman at the river's edge. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. It had been months since he'd seen anyone besides the occasional passing trader or Native American hunting party. But as he watched her drink from the river, her movements slow and careful, he realized she was very real and very pregnant. Zach had come to these mountains 5 years ago, after the war had left him with nightmares and a distaste for crowds. He'd built a cabin 3 miles upstream and lived mostly off the land, trading furs for necessities in the small settlement of Pine Ridge when needed. He wasn't one for company, but the sight of a woman alone in these parts, especially in her condition, stirred something inside him that he thought had died long ago. He stepped from the trees, deliberately making noise so as not to startle her. Still, when Abigail heard the crunch of boots on gravel, she jumped to her feet with surprising agility for someone in her state, her hand going to the small knife at her belt. "Easy now," Zach said, keeping his hands visible and his voice low. "I mean you no harm, madam." Abigail assessed the man before her. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled just above his collar and a beard that couldn't hide the strong line of his jaw. His clothes were worn but clean, and his eyes, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, held no malice. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. "Zachary Blackwood. I live a ways upstream." He nodded toward her midsection. "You look like you could use some help." Abigail kept her knife ready. "I'm fine, thank you." Zach raised an eyebrow. "With all due respect, madam, you're about as fine as a ship without a sail. There's a storm coming in, and these parts get mighty cold at night." As if to punctuate his words, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Abigail glanced up at the darkening clouds and then back at the stranger. She was tired, hungry, and scared, but not foolish enough to trust the first man who came along. "I have food and shelter," Zach continued, "and I give you my word as a gentleman that you'll be safe." Another pain gripped Abigail, sharper this time, and she couldn't hide her wince. Zach took a step forward, concern etching his features, but stopped when she raised her knife again. "I've been waiting for a woman like you," said the cowboy to the pregnant girl at the river's edge, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "Someone who needs help but is too proud to ask for it." Despite everything, Abigail felt a small smile tug at her lips. "That's a peculiar way to introduce yourself, Mr. Blackwood." "Zachary," he corrected. "Or Zach. And I reckon we're in a peculiar situation." He gestured to the sky. That storm's going to break any minute. My cabin's not far. You can have the bed, and I'll take the floor. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, spattering the rocks around them. Abigail hesitated, weighing her options, which were painfully few. Another contraction seized her, and this time she couldn't stop the small cry that escaped her lips. Zach's expression grew grave. Those pains coming regular? Abigail shook her head. Not yet, but they're getting worse. All the more reason to get you somewhere warm and dry. He held out his hand. I won't hurt you. That's a promise. Something in his steady gaze convinced her. Abigail slowly lowered her knife and placed her hand in his. His palm was calloused but warm, his grip firm and reassuring. I'm Abigail, she said. Abigail Warner. Pleased to meet you, Miss Warner. Zach helped her to her feet. Let's get you to safety before this sky opens up proper. The rain was falling steadily by the time they reached Zach's horse, a sturdy palomino gelding tied in a copse of trees. Zach helped Abigail mount, then swung up behind her, one arm protectively around her waist as he guided the horse through the increasingly muddy terrain. Abigail was acutely aware of the strength in that arm, of the solid chest at her back. It had been so long since she'd felt safe, and even though rationality told her to be wary, her instincts said this man could be trusted. As the rain soaked through her clothes and the wind picked up, she was grateful for his warmth and the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them. They rode in silence, Zach occasionally pointing out a landmark or warning of a difficult patch ahead. The cabin appeared through the trees like a vision, solid logs with a stone chimney, smoke curling from it despite the rain. A small barn stood nearby, and a corral where another horse, a bay mare, lifted her head to watch their approach. Home sweet home, Zach said, guiding the palomino to the hitching post by the cabin door. He dismounted first, then helped Abigail down, his hands strong and sure on her waist. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking area beside it. A table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a bed with a patchwork quilt occupied the far corner. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, and provisions. Everything was neat and orderly, speaking of a man who took pride in his home. It's not much, Zach said, suddenly self-conscious as he helped Abigail to a chair, but it's dry and warm. It's wonderful, Abigail said sincerely, looking around at the cozy space. After months of running, of sleeping in barns and cheap boarding houses, this felt like luxury. Zach busied himself with building up the fire and hanging their wet outer garments to dry. He moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to taking care of himself, and Abigail found herself watching his hands strong, capable hands that could likely handle a gun, as well as they split wood or tended a fire. Are you hungry? He asked, turning to find her studying him. Abigail nodded, realizing suddenly that she was famished. Yes, very. I've got venison stew from yesterday. Won't take but a minute to heat it up. He moved to the pot hanging by the fireplace and stirred the contents. And some cornbread if you'd like. That sounds wonderful, Abigail said, her stomach growling in agreement. As Zach prepared their meal, Abigail told him parts of her story, that she was from St. Louis, that she was traveling west to start a new life, that the baby's father was no longer in the picture. She left out the details about who he was and why she had really fled. Trust only went so far. Zach listened without judgment, serving her a generous portion of stew and freshly warmed cornbread. And what brings you to these parts specifically? He asked. Not many choose Montana territory unless they have family or work waiting. Abigail hesitated. I was hoping to reach Oregon. I have a cousin there who would take me in. Oregon's still a fair piece west, Zach observed. And not an easy journey for a woman in your condition. I know, Abigail said quietly. I had planned to reach there before the baby came. But the stage routes were more complicated than I anticipated, and my funds. She trailed off, embarrassed to admit her financial straits. Life has a way of complicating our best plans, Zach said, his voice holding a note of understanding that made Abigail wonder about his own story. You're welcome to stay here until you're strong enough to continue. Or until after the baby comes, if need be. Abigail looked up sharply. That's very generous, but I couldn't impose. It's no imposition, Zach interrupted. Winter's coming, and I'd planned to stock the larder anyway. One more mouth or two won't make much difference. You don't even know me, Abigail protested. Zach's blue eyes held hers. I know enough. You're a woman alone who needs help. Where I come from, that's reason enough. Abigail felt tears prick her eyes and looked down at her bowl. Thank you, she whispered. They finished their meal in companionable silence, the storm raging outside, making the cabin's warmth feel all the more precious. When they were done, Zach insisted Abigail take the bed while he made a pallet by the fire. I won't hear otherwise, he said firmly when she tried to protest. You need proper rest. Too exhausted to argue further, Abigail accepted his offer. The bed, though simple, was the most comfortable she'd slept in for months. The clean scent of pine and something indefinably masculine clung to the pillow Zach sent, she realized. As she drifted off to sleep, the sound of the rain on the roof and Zach's quiet movements around the cabin created a lullaby of security she hadn't known she craved. In the morning, Abigail woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She sat up slowly, her back aching from the weight of her pregnancy. Zach was at the stove, his back to her as he tended to breakfast. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly, the breadth of his shoulders, the way his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck, the careful way he moved, as if mindful of not disturbing her sleep. Good morning, she said, her voice still rough with sleep. Zach turned, a smile warming his features. Morning. Hope I didn't wake you. Figured you could use some food. It smells wonderful. Abigail pushed back the quilt and swung her legs over the side of the bed, wincing as another pain shot through her lower back. Zach noticed immediately. The pain's still coming? They're not regular, Abigail assured him. Just uncomfortable. Zach nodded, though his eyes remained concerned. Storm's passed, but it's left a mess. Creeks running high, and the trails will be mud slicks. Might be best to stay put for a few days, let things dry out a bit. Abigail knew he was right, but the thought of being stranded even in this comfortable cabin with this seemingly kind man made her nervous. I don't want to be a burden. You're not, Zach said simply, placing a plate of eggs and bacon before her. Truth is, it's nice having someone to talk to besides the horses. Over breakfast, Zach told her a little about himself. He'd fought for the Union in the war, though he spoke of it reluctantly and with no pride. Afterward, he drifted west, working cattle drives and in logging camps before settling in this valley 5 years ago. The solitude suited me, he explained. After the war, crowds made me jumpy. Too much noise, too many sudden movements. Abigail understood. She'd seen men come back from the war changed, haunted by what they'd witnessed. And now, she asked, does the solitude still suit you? Zach's gaze met hers across the table, something unreadable in those blue depths. Most days, he said. But I reckon a man can get too used to his own company. Start forgetting how to talk to folks. You seem to be doing just fine, Abigail said with a small smile. A hint of color touched Zach's cheeks, and he ducked his head slightly. Well, that's a relief. Wouldn't want you thinking you'd been rescued by a complete savage. Is that what happened? You rescued me? There was a teasing note in her voice that surprised her. It had been so long since she'd felt comfortable enough to tease anyone. Seems that way, doesn't it? Zach returned, his own lips quirking upward. Though I suspect you'd have managed just fine on your own. You strike me as a woman who knows her own mind. I've had to learn to be, Abigail said, her tone growing more serious. The world isn't kind to women without protection. Zach's expression sobered. No, it isn't. And that's a sorry truth. They fell silent, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant drip of water from the eaves. Abigail felt something shift between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of shared understanding. The day passed quietly. Zach tended to his chores, checking on the horses and splitting more wood for the fire. Abigail, insisting she wasn't an invalid, helped with preparing their midday meal and mending a tear in one of Zach's shirts that she found in a basket by the fireplace. As she worked the needle through the fabric, sitting in a patch of sunlight that streamed through the cabin's single window, she caught Zach watching her. His expression was thoughtful, almost wistful. "What is it?" she asked. Zach shook his head slightly. "Just thinking how different the place looks with you in it. Like it was missing something all this time." The simple honesty of his words made Abigail's heart flutter in a way she hadn't expected. "It's a lovely home," she said. "You've built something good here." "Thank you." Zach's voice was quiet, though it's been just a place to sleep until now. The implication hung in the air between them that her presence had somehow transformed his cabin from a mere shelter into something more. It was too soon for such thoughts, Abigail told herself sternly. She was vulnerable, pregnant, and dependent on his kindness. Any feelings that might be stirring were surely just gratitude on her part, and perhaps loneliness on his. Yet as the day wore on into evening, and they shared another meal by firelight, Abigail couldn't deny the ease she felt in Zach's company. He was respectful of her space, never presuming or pushing for more information than she offered. But he was also attentive, noticing when pain flickered across her face or when she grew tired. There was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged exterior, a sensitivity that spoke of a man who had known his own share of hurt. That night, as Abigail settled into his bed again and Zach made his pallet by the fire, she found herself wondering what it would be like to stay, to make a life in this peaceful valley with this quiet, steady man. It was a foolish fancy, she knew. She barely knew him, and her situation was complicated at best. And yet, for the first time since she discovered her pregnancy, Abigail allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't clouded by fear. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Abigail woke to find Zach already gone, a note on the table explaining he'd gone to check his traps and would be back by midday. She used the time alone to wash properly, grateful for the bucket of fresh water he'd left heating by the fire. She also took the opportunity to explore the cabin more thoroughly. The bookshelves held an eclectic collection volumes of poetry, practical guides to farming and animal husbandry, a few dog-eared novels, and, surprisingly, several books on law and government. These last were well worn, with notes in the margins in a neat, precise hand. Abigail ran her fingers over the writing, wondering about this aspect of Zach she hadn't glimpsed yet. A small wooden box on one of the higher shelves caught her attention. Standing on tiptoe, she managed to reach it and bring it down. Inside was a collection of letters tied with string, a tarnished silver pocket watch, and a daguerreotype of a young woman with Zach's same startling blue eyes. His mother, perhaps, or a sister. Feeling like an intruder, Abigail carefully returned the box to its place. Everyone had their secrets, their private sorrows. She of all people understood the need to keep parts of oneself hidden. She was sitting by the window, sewing a patch on her worn cloak, when Zach returned. He entered with a gust of cold air, his arms full of firewood, and a brace of rabbits hanging from his belt. "Good haul this morning," he announced, stamping his boots on the threshold. "Should make for a fine stew tonight." Abigail set aside her sewing to help him, taking the rabbits while he stacked the wood by the fireplace. Their hands brushed as she reached for the game, and a jolt of awareness passed through her at the brief contact. Zach must have felt it too, for he held her gaze a moment longer than necessary before turning away to remove his coat. As they worked together to prepare the rabbits for cooking, their conversation flowed easily. Zach told her about the valley, about the changing of the seasons here, and the wildlife that called it home. Abigail shared stories of her childhood in St. Louis, of the garden her mother had lovingly tended, of the books she'd read under the shade of old oak trees. What she didn't tell him was how her parents had died of influenza when she was 18, leaving her to the guardianship of an uncle who had seen her as little more than an asset to be leveraged through an advantageous marriage. Or how she had met William Bradford, the charismatic businessman with political ambitions, at one of her uncle's parties. How his attention had made her feel seen for the first time since her parents' death. How easy it had been to mistake his possession for passion. Those were stories for another time, if ever. For now, it was enough to sit in this warm cabin with a man who asked for nothing but offered everything. As Abigail chopped vegetables for the stew, a particularly sharp pain made her gasp and clutch the edge of the table. Zach was at her side instantly, his hand on her elbow to steady her. "Abigail?" The concern in his voice was palpable. "I'm fine," she insisted, though the pain had been stronger than before. "Just a twinge." Zach frowned. That was more than a twinge. How often are these pains coming? Abigail had been trying not to keep track, not wanting to face what they might mean. "Not regularly," she said. "But more often than yesterday." "Sit down," Zach said, guiding her to a chair. "Let me finish this. I can help, I know you can. But humor me." His tone was firm but gentle. "Rest is the best thing for you right now." Abigail reluctantly sat, watching as Zach competently took over the food preparation. There was something deeply appealing about a man who could cook, who didn't consider such tasks beneath him. William had never so much as poured his own drink. "Have you been around many births?" she asked suddenly. Zach looked up from the pot he was stirring. "Animals, yes. People." He hesitated. "Once. During the war. A camp follower. It wasn't. Ideal circumstances." "Did mother and baby survive?" Abigail couldn't keep the anxiety from her voice. Zach's expression softened. "They did. It was a boy." Healthy lungs on that little fellow could hear him crying clear across the camp. Abigail relaxed slightly. "That's good to know." "There's a woman in Pine Ridge," Zach continued. "Mrs. Holloway. She's the closest thing to a doctor these parts have. Acts as midwife when needed. If your time comes while you're here, I could fetch her." "How far is Pine Ridge?" "Normally, about 3 hours' ride. With the trails as they are now, probably closer to 5. Zach set the lid on the pot and came to sit across from her. "Abigail, if you think the baby's coming soon, we should consider heading to town tomorrow. The weather's clear, and the trails will only get worse when the snow starts." Abigail placed a hand on her belly, feeling the strong kick of her child. "I don't think it's immediate," she said. "First babies often take their time, or so I've been told. All the same, might be better to be cautious." Zach's expression was serious. "I'd hate for anything to happen to you out here." The genuine concern in his voice touched Abigail deeply. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me yesterday." "I'm glad I did," Zach said simply. His hand moved across the table as if to take hers, then stopped, returning to his lap. "Very glad." The intensity in his blue eyes made Abigail's breath catch. There was a hunger there, but not the kind she was accustomed to seeing in men's eyes. This was a hunger for connection, for understanding, a loneliness that recognized its match in her own. The moment was broken by another contraction, stronger than the last. Abigail couldn't hide her grimace. "That's it," Zach said decisively. "First thing tomorrow. We're heading to Pine Ridge. No arguments." Abigail nodded, too concerned now to protest. The idea of giving birth in this remote cabin, with only Zach to help, was frightening. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she knew how dangerous childbirth could be even with experienced help. What if the weather turns again? She asked. Then we'll deal with that when it comes, Zach answered. But sitting here worrying won't help either of us. His practical approach was reassuring. Abigail managed a small smile. You're right. And I would feel better with a midwife present. Zach stood, moving to check on the stew. It's settled then. Believe at first light. That evening, they ate their meal in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Abigail's pains continued intermittently, but they remained manageable and irregular. Still, there was a tension in the air, an awareness that their brief idyll might be coming to an end. After dinner, as Zach washed the dishes and Abigail dried them, their hands occasionally brushing, she found herself studying his profile in the firelight. The strong line of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken once, the way his mouth could curve into an unexpected smile. He was handsome in a rugged, unpolished way, nothing like William's cultivated good looks. But there was something infinitely more appealing about Zach's natural grace, about the way he moved with purpose and spoke with honesty. You're staring, Zach observed without looking at her. Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks. I was just thinking about how strange life is. How paths cross when you least expect it. Zach set down the last plate and turned to face her. I've been thinking about that too. About how a day ago I was just going about my business, hunting that deer, and then there you were. Like something out of a dream. A strange dream, Abigail said with a small laugh. A pregnant woman fleeing through the wilderness. The best kind of dream, Zach countered softly. The kind that wakes you up to things you've been missing. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Abigail was acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the way his eyes held hers with a question he was too honorable to ask. Zach, she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say. He waited, patient as always, giving her the space to find her words. But before she could continue, a sharp pain seized her, more intense than any before. She gasped, doubling over, clutching at her belly. Zach's arms were around her instantly, supporting her weight. Abigail? What is it? The baby, she managed through gritted teeth. I think it's coming. Alarm flashed across Zach's face, quickly replaced by determination. Let's get you to the bed. He helped her across the room, his arms strong around her waist. Another contraction hit as they reached the bedside, and Abigail clung to him, burying her face against his chest as the pain washed through her. Breathe, Zach murmured, his hand making soothing circles on her back. That's it. Just breathe through it. When the contraction passed, he eased her onto the bed and knelt beside her, his face level with hers. How far apart are they? I'm not sure, Abigail said, fear edging into her voice. They've been irregular, but that one was much stronger. Zach nodded, his expression grave but steady. We'll time them. If they start coming regularly, we'll know for sure. It's too soon to go to Pine Ridge, Abigail said, her voice trembling slightly. If this is really labor, then we'll manage here, Zach finished for her. His hand found hers, squeezing gently. I won't leave you, Abigail. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. The simple promise nearly undid her. Tears filled Abigail's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. You barely know me, she whispered. You don't owe me this. Zach reached up to brush a tear from her cheek, his touch infinitely tender. Maybe I don't know everything about you, he said, but I know enough. I know you're brave and strong. I know you're running towards something better for your child. And I know that since you walked into my life yesterday, nothing has felt the same. He paused, his eyes searching hers. As for owing, this isn't about debt or obligation. This is about choosing to help someone who matters. Abigail's heart swelled at his words. In that moment, she wanted nothing more than to tell him everything about William, about her fears, about the men she suspected were searching for her. But another contraction seized her, stealing her breath and her words. Zach held her through it, whispering encouragement, his strength a bulwark against the pain. When it passed, he rose, moving with purpose around the cabin, gathering clean linens, heating water, positioning lanterns for better light. His calm efficiency was reassuring, but Abigail could see the worry in the tightness around his eyes. "You should try to rest between the pains," he advised, returning to her side with a cup of water. "It could be a long night." Abigail nodded, sipping the water gratefully. Will you stay close?" "Wild horses couldn't drag me away," Zach promised, settling into a chair he'd pulled up beside the bed. He took her hand again, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I'm right here, Abigail. Right here." As the night deepened, so did Abigail's labor. The contractions came more frequently, building in intensity until she could do nothing but ride the waves of pain, gripping Zach's hand with a force that would have made a lesser man wince. But he never complained, never wavered. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths, helped her walk when she needed to move, and held her when the pain drove her to tears. Between contractions, when she could catch her breath, they talked. Abigail found herself telling him more of her story about her parents, about her uncle's coldness, about meeting William at a society ball and being swept away by his attention. She didn't mention his last name or his political connections, but she told Zach about the gradual realization that what she had mistaken for love was actually control. "When I told him about the baby, he was furious," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said it would ruin everything he'd worked for. He wanted me to get rid of it. When I refused, he threatened to have me committed to an asylum. Said he'd tell everyone I was unstable, delusional." Zach's expression darkened with anger. No man worthy of the name would treat a woman that way. "He gave me a choice: marry him and give the child up for adoption after it was born, or face the consequences." Abigail's hand tightened on his. "I couldn't do it. I couldn't marry a man who would discard his own child, and I couldn't give my baby to strangers. So I ran." "You did the right thing," Zach said firmly. "The brave thing." Another contraction interrupted them, this one so intense that Abigail cried out despite her efforts to remain stoic. When it passed, leaving her gasping and trembling, Zach's face was tight with concern. "They're coming faster now," he observed. "And stronger." Abigail nodded, too exhausted to speak. The night had worn on, and she'd lost track of time. The cabin was warm from the blazing fire Zach maintained, but she shivered nonetheless, her body caught in the grip of forces beyond her control. "I need to check your progress," Zach said, his voice apologetic but firm. "If you'll allow me." Abigail nodded again, past the point of modesty or protest. Zach was as gentle and respectful as possible, but his frown deepened as he examined her. "The baby's coming," he confirmed. "And soon." "But—" He hesitated. "What is it?" Abigail demanded, a new fear clutching at her heart. "I think the baby might be turned wrong," Zach said carefully. "I'm not sure, but from what I remember." Abigail closed her eyes, a fresh wave of terror washing over her. She'd heard stories of difficult births, of mothers and babies lost when things went wrong. "What can we do?" Zach's expression was determined as he met her gaze. "We keep going. We don't give up. And I'll do everything in my power to help you and your child." The hours that followed were a blur of pain and effort for Abigail. Zach was a constant presence, his voice a lifeline in the storm of her labor. He helped her change positions when one became too painful, supported her when she needed to stand, and never once betrayed any disgust or discomfort at the messy, primal process of birth. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Abigail's labor reached its peak. The urge to push became overwhelming, and Zach positioned himself to help guide the baby into the world. I can see the head, he told her, his voice steady despite the tension visible in every line of his body. You're doing wonderfully, Abigail. Just a little more. Gathering her remaining strength, Abigail bore down with all her might, a primal sound tearing from her throat as she fought to bring her child into the world. There was a moment of searing, blinding pain, and then release. The sound of a baby's cry filled the cabin, high and indignant. It's a girl, Zach announced, his voice thick with emotion. A beautiful little girl. Tears streamed down Abigail's face as Zach placed the squalling infant on her chest. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, covered in the evidence of her difficult journey, but to Abigail, she was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Hello, little one," she whispered, running a gentle finger over the damp curls on her daughter's head. "Hello, my brave girl." Zach moved around the bed, efficiently dealing with the afterbirth and cleaning up as best he could. His hands were steady, but when Abigail glanced up at his face, she saw tears tracking silently down his cheeks. "Zach," she said softly. He wiped hurriedly at his face.
"Sorry."
"Just. It's a miracle, isn't it? A brand new person here in the world." Abigail smiled up at him, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "Would you like to hold her?" Zach's eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure?" "Very sure." With infinite care, Zach gathered the now quieter infant into his large hands. He cradled her against his chest, looking down at her tiny face with an expression of such wonder and tenderness that Abigail felt something shift and settle in her soul. "She's perfect," Zach murmured. "Absolutely perfect." As the sun rose fully, bathing the cabin in golden light, Abigail watched Zach with her daughter. He had helped clean and swaddle the baby, then prepared a simple breakfast for Abigail, insisting she needed to keep up her strength. Now he sat beside the bed, the infant asleep in the crook of his arm while Abigail ate. "Have you thought about names?" he asked, his voice low so as not to disturb the sleeping child. Abigail had considered many names over the months of her pregnancy, but now, looking at her daughter's peaceful face, only one seemed right. "I was thinking of calling her Hope," she said, "because that's what she represents to me." "Hope," Zach repeated, testing the name. He smiled down at the baby. "It suits her." "Zach," Abigail began hesitantly, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." He looked up, his blue eyes serious. "You don't need to thank me, Abigail. I'm just glad I was here to help." "Not many men would have done what you did," she persisted. "Taking in a strange woman, delivering her child. It's above and beyond any normal kindness." Zach was quiet for a moment, his gaze returning to the baby in his arms. "When I came out here 5 years ago, I was running too," he said finally. "Not from a person, but from memories. From the things I'd seen and done in the war." He paused, his expression distant. "I thought if I could just get far enough away, if I could find enough silence, maybe the noise in my head would stop." "Did it?" Abigail asked softly. "Some," Zach admitted. "But I discovered something else along the way. Silence isn't always healing. Sometimes it's just empty." His eyes found hers again. "Until yesterday, I didn't realize how empty this place was. How empty I was." The raw honesty in his voice made Abigail's throat tighten. "And now I'm sitting here holding a miracle, talking to a woman who's braver than any soldier I ever knew." A small smile touched his lips. "Doesn't feel empty anymore." The implication hung in the air between them, a question neither was quite ready to voice. Abigail felt her heart racing, not from fear or pain this time, but from a wild, unexpected hope. "What happens now?" she asked. The question encompassed so many things: her recovery, her plans to continue to Oregon, the feelings growing between them that seemed impossible yet undeniable. Zach considered this, his expression thoughtful. "First, you rest and regain your strength. You and Hope both. Then, when you're ready." He hesitated. When you're ready, you decide what you want to do, where you want to go. And if I wanted to stay? The words were out before Abigail could reconsider them. Zach's eyes widened slightly, then softened with an emotion that made her breath catch. If you wanted to stay, he said carefully, I would be the happiest man in Montana Territory. Hope stirred in his arms, her tiny face scrunching as she began to wake. Zach handed her back to Abigail, their hands touching in the exchange, the contact brief, but charged with meaning. Think about it, he said, rising from his chair. There's no rush to decide anything. For now, just focus on getting well. As Zach moved around the cabin, bringing her fresh water and another blanket, Abigail watched him with new eyes. This man who had been a stranger 2 days ago now felt more familiar to her than anyone she had ever known. There was a rightness to his presence, to the way he moved through the space they now shared, that made her wonder if perhaps some things were simply meant to be. The next few days passed in a peaceful rhythm of caring for Hope, resting, and gradually regaining her strength. Zach proved to be an attentive and surprisingly knowledgeable helper, fashioning a crude cradle from a drawer and some blankets, hunting and cooking to ensure Abigail had nourishing food, and even assisting with the baby's care when needed. On the 3rd day after Hope's birth, when Abigail was sitting in a chair by the fire, the baby sleeping contentedly in her cradle nearby, Zach approached with a slightly nervous expression. I've been thinking, he began, sitting on the edge of the table near her. When you're strong enough, we should go into Pine Ridge. Have Mrs. Holloway check you and the baby, make sure everything's healing as it should. Abigail nodded. That seems wise. And, Zach continued, while we're there, we could speak to the preacher. Get Hope's birth properly recorded. Yes, of course, Abigail agreed, though something in his tone made her wonder if there was more to his suggestion. Zach cleared his throat. We could also, that is, if you were willing, we could also speak to him about performing another service. Abigail's heart began to beat faster. What kind of service? Zach met her gaze directly, his blue eyes steady despite the color rising in his cheeks. A wedding. If you'd consider having me as a husband. For a moment, Abigail could only stare at him, stunned by the proposal. Zach, she finally managed. We've known each other less than a week. I know, he acknowledged. And I know it sounds crazy. But Abigail. He took her hand in his touch gentle but sure. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. When I saw you by that river, something inside me just recognized you. Like I'd been waiting all along without knowing what I was waiting for. Tears pricked at Abigail's eyes. But Hope isn't yours, she could be, Zach interrupted. In all the ways that matter, she could be mine. I'd raise her as my own, love her as my own. His voice grew more passionate. And you, Abigail. I know it's soon. I know we're still learning each other. But I also know that I love you. I love your courage, your kindness, your strength. I love the way you look in the morning light, the sound of your voice, the gentleness in your hands when you hold Hope. A tear slipped down Abigail's cheek. Zach, you don't have to answer now, he said quickly. I know it's a lot to consider. I know you have plans, that you are heading to Oregon. All I'm asking is that you think about staying, about giving us a chance to build something together. Abigail looked into his earnest face, this man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect from the moment they met, who had delivered her child with gentle hands and shared his home without hesitation, who looked at her not as a burden or a possession, but as a partner. What about the men who might be looking for me? She asked. It was a fear she hadn't voiced until now, but it had been there, lurking beneath every moment of peace she'd found. Zach's expression grew serious. If they come, we'll face them together. This valley is remote, but not lawless. We have a sheriff in Pine Ridge who's a good man, and I've some knowledge of the law myself enough to know that no man, no matter how wealthy or connected, has the right to force a woman to give up her child. His confidence was reassuring, but Abigail still hesitated. I don't want to bring trouble to your door. It wouldn't be trouble you brought, Zach countered. It would be trouble that followed you, and facing it would be my choice, my privilege as the man who loves you. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Abigail felt something shift inside her, a certainty blooming where doubt had lived for so long. Ask me again, she whispered. Zach's eyes widened slightly, then filled with a hope so bright it nearly took her breath away. He slid from a table to one knee before her chair, still holding her hand in his. Abigail Warner, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. I love you. I want to build a life with you and hope to make a family together. Will you marry me? Abigail looked into those blue eyes that had become so dear to her in such a short time and knew her answer with absolute clarity. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you, Zachary Blackwood. Joy transformed Zach's face. He rose, drawing her gently to her feet, and then, with infinite tenderness, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was a careful kiss, mindful of her still healing body, but it held a promise of passion that made Abigail's heart race. When they parted, Zach rested his forehead against hers. I've been waiting for a woman like you, he murmured, echoing his words from their first meeting. Someone brave enough to take a chance on a lonely cowboy with nothing to offer but his heart and his hands. That's all I need, Abigail assured him, her arms around his waist. Your heart and your hands are worth more than all the wealth in St. Louis. In that moment, with Hope sleeping peacefully nearby and Zach's arms around her, Abigail knew she had found her home not in a place, but in a person. In this man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and found strength to admire, who had helped bring her daughter into the world and now offered to be her father in all the ways that mattered. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges to face, perhaps even dangers. But for the first time since she'd fled St. Louis, Abigail didn't feel alone. And that, she realized, made all the difference. 2 weeks later, on a crisp autumn morning, Abigail stood beside Zach in the small church in Pine Ridge. Hope, dressed in a gown Mrs. Holloway had kindly provided, slept in the arms of the midwife, who had agreed to stand as witness along with a local sheriff. The preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Davis, performed a simple ceremony. Abigail wore her best dress, the only one that still fit comfortably after the birth, with wildflowers Zach had gathered that morning woven into her hair. Zach had donned a clean shirt and his least worn trousers, his dark hair slicked back with water, his beard neatly trimmed. As they exchanged vows, Abigail marveled at the turn her life had taken. 1 month ago, she had been fleeing in fear, uncertain of her future. Now she stood beside a man who loved her, who had already proven his devotion in the most profound ways, pledging to build a life together. I, Zachary James Blackwood, take you, Abigail Elizabeth Warner, to be my lawfully wedded wife, Zach said, his voice clear and confident as he repeated after the preacher. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. When it was her turn, Abigail's voice trembled slightly with emotion, but her eyes held Zach's steadily. I, Abigail Elizabeth Warner, take you, Zachary James Blackwood, to be my lawfully wedded husband. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. The simple gold bands they exchanged had been purchased with the proceeds from Zach's latest for sale plain circles that symbolized a commitment without beginning or end. As Zach slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand steady and warm around hers, Abigail felt a sense of rightness settle deep in her soul. By the authority vested in me by God and the territory of Montana, Reverend Davis proclaimed, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He smiled warmly at Zach. "You may kiss your bride." Zach's kiss was gentle but full of promise, his hands cradling her face as if she were the most precious thing he had ever held. When they parted, his eyes shone with such joy that Abigail felt her own happiness multiply in response. After the ceremony, they shared a meal at the town's small hotel, courtesy of Mrs. Holloway and several other women from the community who had been touched by their story. Hope was passed from arm to arm, admired and cooed over by everyone present. Abigail watched in wonder as Zach proudly introduced his daughter to the townsfolk, his voice filled with a father's love. Later, as they prepared to return to the cabin, their home now, truly Sheriff Morgan pulled Zach aside for a private word. Abigail watched from the wagon, Hope nursing contentedly beneath a light blanket, as the two men spoke in low tones. Zach's expression was serious, but when he returned to her side, he smiled reassuringly. "Everything all right?" she asked as he climbed onto the wagon seat beside her. "Just fine," Zach said, taking up the reins. "Sheriff was letting me know he received a wire about a man from St. Louis asking after a pregnant woman traveling west." Abigail's heart stuttered. "William?"
"Possibly," Zach acknowledged.
But the sheriff told them no such woman had passed through Pine Ridge. "And now that we're married, with Hope's birth recorded under my name." He reached over to squeeze her hand. "You're Abigail Blackwood now, with a husband and a homestead. Even if he came looking, he'd have no legal claim on you or Hope." The relief that washed through Abigail was profound. "Thank you," she whispered. Zach's expression grew tender. "You never have to thank me for protecting what's mine, Abigail.
You and Hope are my family now."
Nothing is more important than that. The journey back to the cabin was peaceful, the autumn landscape a riot of gold and crimson against the deep blue of the Montana sky. As they crested the final hill and the cabin came into view, nestled in its sheltered valley with smoke curling from the chimney, Mrs. Holloway's son had kindly gone ahead to light the fire for their return. Abigail felt a surge of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," Zach said softly as he helped her down from the wagon. "Home," Abigail repeated, the word tasting sweet on her tongue. With Hope cradled in one arm and her other hand in Zach's, she walked toward the cabin, toward their future together. That night, after Hope had been fed and settled in her cradle, Zach and Abigail sat before the fire, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned against his chest. The rhythmic thumping of his heart beneath her ear was the most comforting sound Abigail had ever known. "Are you happy?" Zach asked, his voice a rumble she could feel as well as hear. Abigail tilted her face up to his, letting him see the truth in her eyes. "Happier than I ever thought possible. Even though this isn't what you planned?" His tone was light, but she heard the genuine question beneath it. "A life in the wilderness with a former soldier turned trapper?" "Life rarely gives us what we plan," Abigail said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it gives us what we need instead." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "You are what I need, Zachary Blackwood. You and this home we're building together." Zach turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of that trust," he promised. "You already are," Abigail assured him. "More than worthy." As the fire crackled and Hope slept peacefully nearby, Zach lowered his head to kiss his wife properly, with all the passion and tenderness he had been restraining while she healed. Abigail responded in kind, her arms twining around his neck, her body melting against his as they sealed their vows in the most ancient way. Later, as they lay together in the bed that was now truly theirs to share, Abigail listened to Zach's steady breathing and marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From fear to safety, from isolation to connection, from uncertainty to love, it had all happened so quickly, yet felt as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. Outside, The first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the valley with crystalline white. But inside the cabin, all was warmth and light, and the promise of new beginnings. 5 years later, Abigail stood on the porch of their expanded home, no longer just a cabin but a proper house with separate bedrooms and a parlor, watching as Zach taught Hope to ride her very own pony. At 5 years old, Hope was the image of her mother, with the same chestnut hair and determined chin, but the laugh that rang out across the yard was pure joy, uninhibited by the shadows that had once haunted Abigail. Beside Hope on his own mount sat 3-year-old James, named for Zach's father, his little legs barely reaching the stirrups of the special saddle Zach had crafted for him. And in Abigail's arms, just 6 months old, their youngest daughter Sarah cooed and reached toward her siblings with chubby hands. The valley that had once been Zach's solitary refuge was now home to a thriving family. The original cabin had been expanded twice, first to add a proper bedroom for Hope, then again when James arrived. A larger barn housed not only horses but milk cows and chickens. A vegetable garden flourished behind the house, and apple trees, planted the spring after their wedding, were beginning to bear fruit. Zach had continued his trapping and hunting, but had also, with Abigail's encouragement, begun to raise cattle on a small scale. His knowledge of the land and animals, combined with Abigail's head for figures, had made their homestead modestly prosperous. They would never be wealthy, but they wanted for nothing that mattered. As for William Bradford, he had indeed come looking for Abigail the spring after Hope's birth. But when confronted with Zachary Blackwood, steady, confident, and flanked by Sheriff Morgan and several other men from Pine Ridge, he had quickly reconsidered his claim. The fact that Zach had taken the precaution of having a lawyer from Helena draw up formal adoption papers for Hope, making her legally his daughter in every sense, had settled the matter definitively. Bradford had returned to St. Louis empty-handed, and the last Abigail had heard, through a newspaper that occasionally made its way to Pine Ridge, he had lost his bid for governor amid rumors of impropriety. She had felt no satisfaction at the news, only relief that that chapter of her life was truly closed. Now, watching Zach swing down from his horse to adjust James's grip on the reins, his patience infinite as he explained again the proper way to hold them, Abigail felt a wave of love so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. This man, who had once been a stranger by a river, was now the center of her world, father to her children, partner in her days, lover in her nights. Zach looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still capable of making her heart skip after 5 years of marriage, spread across his face. He said something to Hope, who nodded eagerly, and then he was striding toward the porch, his long legs eating up the distance between them. "How are my girls?" he asked, climbing the steps to join them. He dropped a kiss on Sarah's downy head, then leaned in to claim Abigail's lips in a brief but thorough kiss. "We're perfect," Abigail answered truthfully. "Just enjoying the show. Hope's getting quite good. Takes after her mother," Zach said with pride. "Determined to master everything she tries." "And James?" Zach chuckled. "More interested in the chickens than the horse, I think. But he'll learn." They stood together, watching their older children. Hope was confidently guiding her pony in a small circle, while James had indeed abandoned his mount, now securely tied to the corral post, in favor of chasing a particularly plump hen across the yard. "I got a letter from my cousin in Oregon yesterday," Abigail said after a comfortable silence. "She's inviting us to visit next summer." Zach considered this. "That's a long journey with 3 little ones." "It is," Abigail agreed. "But I think it might be good for the children to see more of the world. And for my cousin to meet them." "Then we'll go," Zach said simply. "I'll start setting aside money for the trip." Abigail leaned her head against his shoulder, grateful as always for his understanding. "Thank you." Zach's arm tightened around her waist. "No need for thanks, love. Your family is our family." The ease with which he included her relatives in his conception of family still touched Abigail deeply. It was one of the countless ways he showed his love, not in grand gestures or flowery words, but in the daily commitment to her happiness and their shared life. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Taking in a pregnant stranger? Becoming a father overnight?" Zach looked down at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Regret the best decision I ever made? Not for a single moment." His voice grew more serious. "Abigail, before you and Hope came into my life, I was existing, not living. You gave me purpose, a reason to build something lasting." He glanced at their children, his expression softening. "You gave me a family, a future. How could I regret that?" Abigail rose on tiptoe to kiss him, Sarah squirming between them. "I love you, Zachary Blackwood. And I love you, Abigail Blackwood." His blue eyes, still as vivid as the Montana sky, held hers with the same intensity they had that first day by the river. "I've been waiting for a woman like you my whole life, even when I didn't know it." As the sun began to set over their valley, casting long golden shadows across the land they had made their own, Abigail reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led her here. The fear and uncertainty that had driven her west had given way to a joy and security she had never dared to imagine. In fleeing one future, she had found another, one built on love, respect, and the daily choice to face life's challenges together. And as Zach called the children in for supper, as Hope ran to take Sarah from Abigail's arms with all the pride of a big sister, as James abandoned his chicken chasing to race toward his father with arms outstretched, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, home, in every sense of the word, with a family that had found each other against all odds on the wild frontier of Montana.